today is the third Hot Off the Press event where we present and discuss recently published books which address the challenges of urban futures somehow, directly or indirectly. And today we have the pleasure of having John Forrester with us, discussing his latest book, How Spaces Become Places, Placemakers Tell Their Stories, published last year, actually, but still within the time frame. And John Forrester, actually, we met for the first time 2008, when we were both part of the NICE's, let's say, scientific advisory board, which was reviewing projects funded by the Dutch Science Foundation and addressing urban issues. John Mollenkopf, who is also here today with us, was also part of a panel. Paul Cheshire from LSE, Alan Murray, and a few other people. And it was really a nice program, and we got to know each other, and we appreciated both the work of the colleagues funded, but also our work and our exchanges. I think it was a very stimulating period of time, and that's how we met for the first time. And it's a really pleasure to have you here now. I will very shortly say a few words about yourself, but maybe you can integrate. John works very much, as you have probably seen from his CV, and Paul will post Google Scholars links and stuff in the chat. He works on the micropolitics of planning. He works at Cornell at Ithaca, the United States. And as the dedication of his book tells us, he has a very dialogic way of approaching issues. For my students, searching for possibilities, sources of surprise and insight. I have to say I like that very much, and that's very much tells us about himself, the way in which he approaches issues, and the way in which he approaches also disputes, differences, dramas, and things like that, about which he wrote really a lot. And when we first met and he talked about his issues, so dealing with differences, dramas of mediating public disputes, I think it's a very important contribution, and many others. So he was entering into the planning field with a very peculiar perspective about entering in a dialogue with actors. And that's all what it's about here today, also when we talk about these issues. So thanks for being with us and for discussing and presenting your book and discussing it with us later. We invited, actually I invited Tommaso Vitale to act as a discussant, which I also thank very much. We know each other a bit longer than with John. Actually, we were not kids, but we have some years of difference. Tommaso just recently has been appointed as the new dean of the urban school at Sciences Po, so big congratulations. Following Patrick Legalès, so the steps of a master, not an easy task to follow, but actually Tommaso was building up the school, helping building it up, and working on governing the large metropolis mass. So a lot of pieces of a big puzzle. So I think he was definitely one of the best to do this and carry on this heritage in the future. And I asked him actually to join today because he's he's an associate editor, but also one of the founders, as far as I remember, the journal Partecipazione e Conflitto, Participation and Conflict, which actually gives him a peculiar entry point into the issues we are discussing today. And also, Tommaso, despite the fact that he's living in Paris since a long time, actually comes from Italy. And participation in Italy, it's very different than participation in different parts of the world. And this view, I think it's a nice complement on John's perspective from the book. So I think the dialogue could be very fruitful after the presentation. So I very much also thank you, Tommaso, for being here today. So I stop here That was more than enough as a presentation. And I give the floor to John, who won't have a PowerPoint presentation. So we will have a nice live presentation about the issues addressed in the book. John, the floor is yours. Take the time you need, and then we will have Tommaso. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, Tommaso. It's an honor to join you all. It's wonderful to see some old friends who I haven't seen in an embarrassingly long time. And since as the preface to this book looks like this, this is looking at a map of Rome in the City Museum of Rome in the picture. As the preface to this book explains, this has set my record for the longest time from early idea to ultimate publication, probably about 15 years, something like that. And 4 other books came out in the meantime. So it's not like I wasn't doing anything, but this just took forever for various reasons. So I look forward to your comments. And let me tell you what this project has been about. In How Spaces Become Places, placemakers tell their stories. We find detailed, practical accounts of architects and designers, urban planners, and community activists who teach us about innovative and collaborative work. Let me give you some examples. In Selwood, a neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, neighbors reclaimed and refashioned their intersections. In Providence, Rhode Island, residents transformed the river running through their downtown with music and bonfires to create the water fire festivals. In Oldham, nearby Manchester in the UK, congregants of different faith communities began to self-segregate themselves less and to meet together more often, to ask questions and to learn from and about one another. In Brooklyn, New York, a community justice center committed to safety and services alike significantly transformed public trust and community engagement too. On the Oregon coast, planners committed to community engagement, transparency, and accountability put participatory design to work. In Oakland, California, architects worked against racial animus and common convention by integrally involving community members in iterative design processes. In Rochester, New York, and New York Mills, Minnesota, community activist planners leveraged the power of the arts to transform ordinary spaces into vibrant places. In all of these and still other cases, placemakers worked collaboratively and responsively with residents in the face of legacies of fear and violence, distrust of government and of experts too. These placemakers worked neither solo nor in silos. They were not rocket scientists or geniuses, not heroes. Instead, they were, this book shows, experienced, talented, and diversely trained improvisers who responded to local conditions by asking local residents and diverse experts alike, both what might be possible and how it might be possible, how community members, authorities, and specialists could work together to transform underused or unsafe or dormant spaces into vibrant, useful, attractive places. To say that these placemakers were often facilitators and good, responsive listeners who convened productive conversations and made music together, that'd be true, but it understates the case dramatically. Collaborating for 20 years together, my colleague Scott Peters and I have developed a method of producing what we call profiles of practitioners in the form of practice-focused oral histories. This method has now led me to publish 8 books exploring the micropolitics of urban planning and placemaking practices. These studies have presented the work of planners and mediators in the United States, participatory action research responses to Hurricane Katrina, Dutch street-level Democrats, Italian and Israeli planners and placemakers, and more. In each case with colleagues, I've sought to examine and interpret urban actors' practical judgments, their situated responses to difficulties, the practical ethics and politics of their daily work more broadly. But underlying this empirically oriented method, practice-focused oral histories. Of course, there has been a theoretical agenda and a backdrop, one that I have called a critical pragmatism. The contribution of a critical pragmatism to the planning, placemaking, and policy studies literature might best be put, if somewhat polemically, this way. That literature has kept a dirty little secret, and that secret is this: somebody has to do the work. Somebody has to do the work. Real actors must not only think about or imagine the future of cities, the dynamics of policies, the character of places, the resistance to neoliberalism, but real actors have to work with others in the face of power and conflict, uncertainty and ambiguity, given opposition and possibilities of coalitions, to actually shape those futures, to improve those policies, to transform those spaces into better places. Someone has to do the work. So a critical pragmatism suggests an approach that a more conventional pragmatism might not. Conventionally, or colloquially, pragmatism seems to imply expediency, doing what's possible within the apparent constraints, acting without scrutinizing the contingencies of those constraints, acting as if one must be resigned to given status quo relationships of power. But a critical pragmatism, in contrast, represents a theory of action that situates actors in evolving, conflict-ridden, structurally shaped settings in which relationships of power, so-called, are hardly monolithic, as if without vulnerabilities and limits of their own. A critical pragmatic account explores not only action then, but how actors recognize that their contexts are contingently and politically constructed themselves, thus open to creative adaptation, challenge, and change. Further, a critical pragmatism presumes settings of plurality and thus conflict, of interdependence, and so the inevitable need for negotiation and even mediation. So a critical pragmatic account of planning practice can be quasi-naturalistic in two senses. First, it recognizes the historical, political, and ethical settings in which planners and placemakers actually work, settings of plurality, complexity, interdependence, normative fluidity. Second, it assesses how planners and placemakers perform the practical judgments, the caring discernment that allows them to work in those settings, to organize, manage, invent, disrupt, and change working relationships. Beginning with the recognition of actual planners and placemakers' pragmatic imperative, the need to answer the question, now what? A critical pragmatic view of their work must also try to do justice to their crafting relationships with diverse others as they act context responsively, and thus as they must improvise in doing so. So the project of a critical pragmatism that motivates gathering practice-focused oral histories works to take agency seriously, to situate it in politically entangled contexts, contexts open to possible futures that are contingently more or less just, beautiful, efficient, or sustainable. In that intellectual context, the voices and experiences, the surprises and mistakes, the moves and the tips of practitioners wrestling with planning, placemaking, and policy analysis become historical data. Certainly not last words about that work, but first words to honor phenomenologically and to take into account. Now the strategy, excuse me, the strategy of producing practice-focused oral histories builds in at least two protections against unbridled subjectivity, speculation, or random opinion. First, curiously but crucially, these interviews work to ask not, what did you think about, for example, the pressure from the politician, but instead to ask, how did you respond to, handle, deal with, move in regard to the pressure from the politician? This deceptively simple shift in interviewing focuses attention on grounded practice, on situated action, on detailed accounts of what practitioners did when, and not on cognition, opinion, analysis, speculative hopes or fears, asking not what did you think about X, but how did you respond to X? We can learn from that richness of practical response in ways that extend well beyond the practitioner's own rationales. No one has put this insight better than the moral philosopher Iris Murdoch, who wrote of our learning from examples of good conduct this way. Murdoch wrote, "Where virtue is concerned, we apprehend more than we clearly understand, and we grow by looking." Let me read it again. Where good conduct is concerned, we apprehend more than we clearly understand. We see more than we know in a way, and we grow by looking. It's an astonishing passage. Second, these interviews sought carefully to ask practitioners not, why did you do X, but rather, how did you come to do X? As field workers know, asking another person why they did something can evoke a reason or a justification or a motivation that prompted them to act as they did. But in none of those cases does the interviewer learn about their more detailed reading of the context in which they acted and how they fit their enacted response to that context. So in interviews about lines of practical judgment, not about what they were thinking, so in interviews about lines of practical judgment, we can do better by asking about their reading of the pragmatic situation. How did you come to do X, what you did? So that we evoke not an abstract justification or a reason, but a grounded descriptive account of a practice situation and their response. Now, so learning about practical judgment requires detailed renderings of both practices and complex contexts together, so that students and researchers alike can appreciate and discern context-responsive, context-appropriate practical actions. The striking power of these profiles and classes has come without doubt from the legibility and accessibility of these practice stories as told in the first-person voices of the practitioners. And we as readers can learn from these accounts, as students have in classes, in several ways. First of all, that accessibility and first-person voice register allows an identification with the practitioner who's given the account of their work. And that allows a learning via empathy and recognition of the morally entangled situations the practitioner has faced. So El Zelinka, for example, reports working on the Oregon coast and hearing that local residents had been put off by the jargon of mixed use spoken by previous consultants who've been subsequently fired. As Zelinka learned, so students could learn with him in that case. Similarly, when Malik Yakini points out African Americans' resistance to young and white, presumptuous and condescending do-gooders coming to Detroit with a missionary attitude, quotes, students can find their own presumptions checked in class, just as students of color have felt affirmed, having had experiences similar to Yakini's, dealing with white presumptions. More generally, as practitioners have recounted how they have learned from surprises, for example, students and other readers can learn with them too, recognizing the unexpected following the practical logic of response to such surprise and action. Here, the reader learns as the practitioner has learned, internally within the story. But second, readers can learn not just from the style, cadence, twists, and turns of the practitioners speaking, from their narrated recollections, but also from the ways that their narrated work addresses or fails to address particular concerns and questions that the reader brings to the text. Externally, we might say. So as readers, we might be interested in questions of power or exclusion or uncertainty or negotiation or empathy or coalition building and much more. And by asking from a given narrative profile how its examples of practice might inform those issues, we can learn too. So when Mike Piatok describes his firm's use of design kits to involve community members in iterative processes of suggesting housing layouts and changes, talking together, weighing various options, advantages and disadvantages, readers interested in deliberative processes can learn about their discretely and temporally ritualized aspects as well. Now, so what sort of stories are these? Let me say a little more about them. In the opening chapters, we see Piatok's work as an engaged architect building affordable housing and facing neighbors' distrust and fears of who the new tenants might be. We see Zelinka commuting from California to the Oregon coast to plan for 4 small municipalities after they had fired the first planner, who seemed more attached to their jargons than to their clients. Piatok explains how a series of design exercises enabled his staff to learn about the views and needs and fears of site neighbors, just as they also allowed the neighbors and prospective tenants to learn about design possibilities as well. Detailing several projects, Piatok shows how designers can collaborate with diverse community members, and we see how such collaboration can produce not only better design, but also political support when the time comes to go to city authorities, a planning commission or city council, for example, for formal support and approval. In Zelinka's case, we see the difference between hit and run consultants visiting briefly and then dropping off their reports, as consultants might do at times, and what Zelinka calls a community immersion process, stretches of round-the-clock time in the community, contacting press and politicians, multiple civic groups, and passersby in an attempt to announce and actually enact a commitment to transparency, openness to ideas and criticisms, and so to accountability too. Zelinka's version of community planning and placemaking clearly is not to bring outside deliverables to these communities, but to brainstorm and invent and assemble design ideas with community members who will then own their own placemaking efforts as implemented. In the book's middle chapters, we turn to placemakers who have had to wrestle with race and inequality, with intergroup antagonisms and even violence. James Brodick worked with the Brooklyn community members to develop a multi-service community justice center and youth court in the Red Hook neighborhood, known for its violence and drug problems. Father Phil Sumner moved to Oldham from one low-income side of Manchester to another, arriving on 9/11, the day, arriving in the wake of racial and anti-immigrant tensions. In a stunning indication of the community setting Father Phil inherited, when he asked his own new parishioners how they were getting along with their neighbors in the Islamic community, he heard, "Well, we don't really talk to them, do we?" He had his work cut out for him, and his chapter details that work, from convening interfaith dialogues and any questions meetings to assembling and recognizing the musicality and cultural performances of Filipino and African community choirs. Brodick had come to Red Hook when community trust in the criminal justice system stood, surveys reported, at about 12%. So Brodick too had a tall hill to climb. He did that, as he details it, with the extensive use of community members surveying their own neighbors to learn about and define both problems and solutions together. Along the way, Brodick's accountability and responsiveness to the Red Hook community became increasingly evident in the widening scope of services that the Community Justice Center came to offer, extending not only to employment and family services, but even to summer baseball leagues for youth. Placemaking here had left the architects and landscape designers' sketch pads far behind. In Red Hook, Brooklyn, and Oldham near Manchester, these placemakers were creating safer communities, reducing threats of violence, building interreligious and interracial relationships and coalitions, all in and through collaborative, virtuous circles, not through technocratic, quick fix efforts. In Azusa, California, near Los Angeles, soon-to-be planning professor Karen Umamoto found herself challenged not only to do the mapping of hate crimes and racial violence in the community, but to work with members of the Azusa Human Relations Commission. Umamoto's case merges subtle rituals and sophisticated mapping, storytelling and recognition, initial suspicions at times giving way to acknowledgement and even partnership, as diverse, fearful, mutually wary community members came together to try to create a safer community for them all. We see in 2 chapters about urban gardening too, curiously enough, substantial lessons about placemaking and political history. In Detroit, Malik Yakini explains that the development of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network had been inextricably interwoven with Black community struggles for self-determination and autonomy. Located in a history of suspicions of the resurgent power of the white suburbs. His account had been in response to a young white student from the nearby University of Michigan, a student initially appalled that Yakini was not more welcoming to her and her overtures for help. Graciously but firmly, Yakini explains that what the student thought were the Black community's problems were instead the all too familiar presumptions of white outsiders. Too often, such outsiders had been more confident in their own knowledge than they were curious about and respectful of the Black community's particular political history and their felt needs for dignity and power. Yakini's experience shows clearly the limits of any placemaking attempts that remain blind to racial and political history. In Paris, Laurent Baudelaire explains not only the development of community gardens, but how community gardeners had to overcome the resistance, incredulity, and dismay of what she terms the patrimony of traditional French landscape architects and designers. Baudelaire recalls her participation on a university jury assembled to judge a landscape architecture student's final project that attempted to design a garden, allowing maximal community input and design discretion, minimizing the a priori control and specifications of traditional designers. Baudelaire's more traditional colleague on the jury was appalled. "This will be the death of the profession," he said. "This will be the death of the profession." The lesson for placemaking, of course, design creativity and community involvement might both depend on the weakening, if not the death, of some of the traditional prerogatives of the design professions that have at times worked more to preserve the designer's power and authority and less to foster collaborative creativity and innovation with ever more diversifying communities. In all these cases, placemakers leverage place attachment to fuel efforts not simply for change, but for community empowerment and self-determination, working with rather than against sources of expertise where necessary, and building relationships in place that enacted virtuous circles, virtuous as community members worked to enhance the places they cared about. In 4 chapters 2, placemakers show how diverse forms of art can inspire and contribute to local activities to transform neglected spaces into safer, even wondrous places. In Providence, Rhode Island, Barnaby Evans had the simple idea to integrate water and fire in a public art celebration. Residents might stroll along the riverside downtown. Braziers of wood placed in the river would burn in the evening light. Music would play. He tried it. Word spread and people loved it. This supposedly one-time event was a victim of its own success, and Waterfire was born, becoming a repeated event generating international attention, arts awards, and substantial revenues for the city, even as it required navigating webs of permitting, insurance costs, security measures, food regulations, and more. In Eagleby, Queensland, community planner Wendy Sarkisian partnered with artist Graham Dunstan to reclaim a public park that had fallen into disrepair. Sarkisian merged her interest in theater and performance with Dunstan's artistry as they organized a public march to reclaim the community's park. Parents and children together had written hopes and fears on scraps of paper. These went into a papier-mâché sculpture Dunstan and residents had built together. Then, after marching to the park with lighted candles as afternoon turned to evening, Eagleby residents encircled the sculpture resting in the park. And as they sang together, They torched the sculpture in a cathartic ritual of reclaiming not only the park, but their own agency to make the park theirs once more. In Sarkissian's account, we see placemaking rest upon aesthetics and ritual, community theater, and community building too. Hardly least of all, in New York Mills, Minnesota, and Rochester, New York, readers learn of the less fiery, but no less transformative work of John Davis and Doug Rice. Both worked as community members and community activists, community organizers, to build trust in their communities, to appreciate the role that arts might play, be a local arts center or the city's museums and public sculptures, to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. In both cases, readers see that existing bureaucracies called for navigation and negotiation. Davis had to overcome the skepticism of the more traditional economic development advisor. Rice had to explore and craft working agreements with transportation engineers to create safer streets and intersections. But in both cases, the appreciation of the transformative possibilities of the arts inspired not only these placemakers, but the community members with whom they lived and worked. Each of these placemakers faced and overcame disagreements and disputes, not through the force of academic argument, but by patient and persistent attention to more attractive alternatives, options for placemaking that were attractive aesthetically and financially as well. Now, throughout all of these chapters, readers can recognize how long-standing racial politics and economic inequalities provided contentious context for the work of placemaking. If elements of rival arguments and dispute pervaded these placemaker stories, nevertheless, one chapter, wholly devoted to a dispute involving regional economic development, transportation, and historic preservation, stands out. Mike Hughes details his work enabling 28 stakeholders at odds with each other at scales ranging from local preservationists through regional environmental activists to state and federal authorities to resolve a complex 30-year-old dispute. Hughes's account is easily worth the price of the book. Hughes explains to the transportation and highway engineers eventually we see that if they wish to construct a new bridge across the St. Croix River at the Wisconsin-Minnesota border, they will have to let the assembled 27 other stakeholders, they were one, they will have to let the assembled 28 stakeholders design the shape, the massing, and the aesthetics of the bridge. Because, as he said, told them, because they simply don't trust you, the state engineers, to design it yourself. He might have been speaking Greek to them, of course, but he was not. And the engineers' authorities realized that indeed, they had to let Hughes mediate an expertly informed but not determined design discussion. This story has to be read to be believed, but viewing the photos of the resulting stakeholder-designed bridge as actually built across the St. Croix River, thanks in part to Hughes's placemaking intervention, provides the proof. So, let me sum up. These placemaking accounts are both richly detailed, narratively compelling, pragmatically instructive. Even if any list of lessons learned here risks being both simplistic and reductive, I will suggest just a few. First, these placemakers teach us they don't work alone. So they decenter the authority of design experts and they socialize, share, and diffuse responsibility for transforming spaces into places. Second, these practitioners plan with others and they understand that their joint product must not be an a priori or good intention, but the joint product has to be good actions that will adapt and respond to conditions of use. Whether the product is a network of community gardens, affordable housing, an actual bridge between neighboring states, or safer streets where violence had previously threatened community residents. So these placemakers do far more than produce plans. They improvise responsively, practically, and politically with others in the spaces at hand. Third, they all involve expertise carefully, making sure that expertise remains accountable, not autonomous. Fourth, and hardly least of all, these cases teach us about the importance of place attachment in virtuous circles of engagement and creativity. We see the vibrancy, innovation, and transformative qualities of what we might call collaborative improvisation. Collaborative because rooted in conditions of interdependence, difference, and connectivity. Improvisation because community members together with designers are changing their worlds, changing their context, changing their spaces into fresh places in real time, as only a daring and a caring improvisation together can craft such placemaking changes with wonder, imagination, and ongoing commitments. Thank you for your attention and your questions. This was fun and a pleasure to work with all those people to gather their stories and edit them and go back and forth to them. And I'm sure you have lots of questions, and I'm eager to see what you have in mind. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. Very nice and inspiring synthesis, actually, but actually a path through the book, which distills some key elements which can be part of the discussion later on.
Yep.
Immediately give the floor to Tommaso so that he can react, comment, ask, and then we will start the open discussion. Tommaso.
Thank you very much, Yuri. And please stop me after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, because I guess that this book and John really deserves to have the most interactive webinar that we can construct all together. So John, thank you. For me, it's a big honor to have this. I'm touched and moved to have this honor to discuss this book. And I would say that firstly, and to be very clear, when you say that at the end, maybe some conclusions are a little bit trivial, they are not trivial at all. This is a massive contribution, a way to accumulate knowledge, a very important book. It's something that bring us the best of possibilism and Hirschman heritage and legacy, and the best of trust on the capacity of professionals to enter into political contention and to change things in a durable way. So it's not trivial at all. And everything in the book, I just want to say this, from the foreword till the appendix have to be read. Even the appendix are deserve to be read. It's impressive. I trust you that it took 15 years for you to finalize it, and I really want to say this is inspiring. So to have a long-term project where you involve so many practitioners, and for the people that listen to this webinar, I just want to invite you to read it, and you will see immediately how much work has been done by John, because yes, there are many chapters, a lot of stories written by many people, a lot of really individual leadership and collective intelligence, but at the same time, the reading is perfectly consistent. So we really see how much work you have done on the book. And so point number two, I guess that moving back to giving value to, I will not use your term practice. I will say really the work of these working people, making places with their expertise that is coming from planning studies, but is modest and open, where problems and issue of accountability and self-reflexivity on what technicians may do badly and how limit themselves and try to engage not too much, being present, but not, let's say, colonize the field. This is an extremely important contribution in a moment in which self-reflection on the power of technicalities and the power of technicians are less present than in the past. Point number 3, I would like to focus on some points that seems to me important to open the discussion. I will start from, let's say, an exercise that I enjoy in doing in comparing the different places and placemakers that you have collected and bring together in this kind of written collective that tell us so much. It seems to me that there are many points in common from this experience, that sure, they are site-specific, that they are contingent, and they are contextual. They are contingent because they are contextual, but there are many points that are in common. So plurality of actions, of instruments, of actors, and of processes to change norms or rules, they are always present. A certain fluidity in the roles, a certain capacity of these practitioners to be modest in the sense of transmitting knowledge and acquiring knowledge, this kind of flows of exchanges between, let's say, modest leaders that try not to be arrogant and try to transmit and receive. This is always present in the stories that you have told us. There is something that is not always present in the cases, and that is much more present when what is at stake is providing, maybe not changing the built environment, not providing housing units, not providing gardens and foods, but where the dimension of service, so to say, relation producing relations, is at stake. In these cases, and especially all the cases where services are trying to reduce crime and the violent side of urban life, in these cases, what we see is interdependency. Actors that recognize much more than in other cases that they are not only not alone, that they do not have only to involve the community, but they cannot do anything alone and with individual leadership or with small groups action, that they are completely dependent from the others. And yes, interdependency, you stress it a lot. Yes, even if this plural community of heterogeneous people producing affordable housing, gardens, food, yes, even there is a sense of interdependency. But it's not so strong as when the service side is more present. I don't know why. Maybe my comparative exercise is wrong, but it's something that I wanted to offer to the discussion. Interdependency, not only as an objective condition, but as a subjective way to provide meaning to the limits of each actors. Interdependency as a specific forms of reflexivity to recognize, admit, and work on depending on the others is stronger when what is at stake is violence, crime, and very severe conflict. I don't know why, but it seems to me that when the stakes are not only producing, but there is a mix of a community looking for security, trying to protect themselves and producing services and changing, but where there is something at stake in terms of security, from a very progressive point of view, this capacity to admit the dependency on the others seems to me stronger. Point number 4. It seems to me that something that we know that sometimes in your work was present, that sometimes is discussed in theories of very advanced and broad urban policy, urban planning, that is almost forgotten when moving towards the technicalities of urban design. And that is very important and coming from maybe not all the stories, but almost all the stories and chapters, is the relevance of the ritualization of collective action. Mm. Wow. This is strong sometimes in, let's say, political science, but it was more in the past. Due to some kind of obsession sometimes by many urban studies towards a big and only one factors of capital accumulation explaining everything bad in the city, we have a little bit lost the idea that counter movements, forms of active placemaking and policy change do not pass only through the magic dyadic forms of action, criticism and prefiguration, but also through celebration, that these forms of ritualization in doing that may pass through arts or just by sociability, but ritualized, starting and stopping at a certain point, by ritualization of contingency, by ritualization of failures. There is a chapter also where things are not always going well, but they party the failures and bring on new activities. I think that these elements of ritualization is very important. And then moving to point number, I guess, 5, I would like to discuss the framework where this relevance of pluralism and diversity in the action between ordinary people, lay people, and practitioners, highly skilled practitioners, through leaders recognizing their dependency on the others. When this complexity and diversity is interpreted in terms of critical pragmatism. I would say that your proposal of a critical pragmatism is extremely rich and important to overcome some of the discursive limits of pragmatism. But I don't think it is completely able to cover all the richness of the stories you have collected and interpreted. It seems to me that in critical pragmatism, there is still this relevance of the truly legacy of the first pragmatism, which is the fact that open processes are very important means for learning. That democracy is a learning regime because it's open, it's endless, and that processes are better than products, that these forms of mobilization are better than plan because they are open, and in time, learning emerges. But what I have seen in the cases is openness, but not endless openness. And it seems to me that we have to discuss this because the legacy of pragmatism is very inspiring, but it is also an exhausting ideology because everything is open, because learning is a little bit an evolutionary outcome of processing time, because we do not fully grasp when we have fantastic experiments and good local contingent placemaking, but not really innovation, in the sense that things do not get stable, that things are changing in new configuration, as you say many times to interpret, but procedures and contents in professional jobs do not change in a stable way, not even in the context. And that we have to, I guess, discuss about the fact that some of this experience mobilize rituals to define a period of time in which things start and stop, that try to balance the complexity of mobilization with a reflexive contingency. So to say, not to maintain everything always open. So I would say that your approach is a moderate critical pragmatism, where openness and the evolutionary meaning of processing time is there, but more as something to look at, not as always present, not as an ideology, not as a goal in itself. I'd like to finish trying to discuss something that for me remains very important, and it's the fact that maybe not 100%, but most of the stories and case studies of these brilliant planners working with the community are cases of contention, are cases where nothing is easy, where the interests at stake are very important, where even to move a little step up, contention have to be played at the major level and at many levels, and that it seems to me that more than conflict in itself, what helps to have positive outcomes, effects, is the capacity at a certain point to break up conflicts and arrive to some kind of resolution mechanism. For me, it's inspiring. You have good and important but short pages on the topic that I will require all my students to read because they are extremely important. I want to highlight them more for the discussion. It's not conflicts that allow to learn. It's not how you enter into conflicts and how you, at the end of the day, very classically make pressure and change the power relationship. Is how you maintain a control on how to manage and solve these conflicts that produce more resources, especially for the weakest. So we have no cases where people break up or surrender. In many cases, they negotiate and stop and renegotiate and stop. There are not many cases in which these groups delegate to others the resolution of conflicts. They try to maintain some kind of ownership on the process of keep on trying to solve the conflicts. For sure, no delegation, more negotiation seems to be very common to all of them. And for sure, they are extremely reflexive on avoiding any form of violence and coercion, especially from police or from anyway, local government or the local state against them. But we are back to some of the points that I stressed before. Interdependency and the capacity to mobilize larger networks of actors seems to me, in reading your book, related to some reflexivity, some strategy, not only to influence, but to influence because we want to protect themselves. That this dimension of security for the community that we will do in a contentious way, but we will also stop and manage not to see an escalation coming from police and the state. This capacity to involve more, but not delegate, to negotiate to protect, seems to me something really important that you show us, and something that changed some, let's say, simplistic vision of conflicts like different interest, conflict, so deliberation, learning, and more democracy. No, it's not this. There is a part of this leadership of planners want to make places that pass to strategies that balance well, break up, surrender, negotiate, delegation, and coercion, and that they know very well how to strategize to avoid something, not to surrender at all, and to keep on moving, but at certain points stopping. Process, yes, but not endless. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks a lot, Tommaso. There is a lot on the plate, I have to say. John, you want to first react because there were many issues have been addressed.
My first question is, why didn't I meet Tommaso 20 years ago? Because it will take that long to work through these. Your questions are wonderful. Your questions are I had a little trouble with it. Let me just note a couple of things, and because there's a great deal to say, and Yuri, I want to figure out how the broader group can work. But quickly, there's Tommaso in a way points to two concepts that we use much too easily and clumsily, and they are the notion of context and contextualization, which is, I like to say to my students, it's a weasel word. Mm-hmm. People say, yes, it all depends on context. Well, yes, of course, it all depends on context. So then you have to ask, well, what does it depend upon? And then you don't talk about the word context anymore. You talk about law or bureaucracy or procedure or whatever, you break it down. So part of where Tommaso's beginning is with the complexity of how we think about how we think about context, because of course, these stories, one's from Australia, another one is from the UK, another one from Paris, they're urban and rural in the States. So, most simplistically, you say, well, these are all different contexts. It has to be, what can we say across them? Well, you can say a great deal in the same way that there's a sociology of law. Yes, there's law, but there's law, there's structures, there's discretion, there's ambiguity, there's interpretation, and there's a great deal we can say even as laws vary. And so this notion of contextualization is hugely important, that we don't get stuck on it as if context is a last word and not a first word. And let me just point quickly on this. I've tried to, I would love people's responses to the following notion. Context responsiveness is something that we talk about all the time. We talk about our abilities to respond to act differently in different contexts. We take that as a sort of, in a way, a sociologically natural move. And we appeal to context responsiveness all the time. And it links, I think, to two other concepts that we use less often but seem relevant. One is the notion of discretion, right? Which has a more institutional kind of resonance. And the other is improvisation. And I've tried to write about improvisation, and I've had reviewers write back, the blind reviewers, they write back and say, well, improvisation by its very nature is the kind of thing you can't analyze. So, I mean, reminds me of the people who, 100 years ago said, you know what, automobiles will never go more than 64 miles an hour. Well, yeah, and then one goes 70, and there goes that theory. I mean, what kind of crazy idea is it? I mean, Carl Weick is, the obvious exception here. What kind of crazy idea is it that improvisation by its nature can't be analyzed? So I wrestled with those reviewers, and it struck me that instead of saying improvisation, instead of talking about improvisation, we should talk about context responsiveness. Everybody knows we respond to context all the time. And I was trying to argue there's a structure to improvisation. Well, it's a structure of context responsiveness. Nobody says we can't nobody's ever argued we can't analyze context responsiveness. So there's a triad of concepts that they're not quite the same, but they're all closely related. That's context responsiveness, improvisation, and discretion. So A is something that I want to work on, and if people have thoughts about that, love to know. Tommaso pointed out in at least 3 different times, I think, the notion of a sort of reflexive subjectivity of some of the actors involved here, whether they were professionals or not. In half of my cases, the lead actors are not professionals so much as community activists, who wanted to make their communities better. And Tommaso noted a sense of modesty, of curiosity, of limits, of self, I would say of humility. And that's important that, well, it's certainly a characteristic of these people's engagements with others. The more they were full of themselves and their own ideas, the more they would come across as arrogant, and the less they would be able to organize with others, certainly. Let me skip the third, which is least clear to me. The notion of ritualization and even celebration is really great, because there is so much work on, let's say, organizing or single issue work or mobilization about conflict that is strategic and instrumental, and basically ignores so much of the sociality and the richer sort of political relationships that it takes to work together, mobilize together, maintain resistance over time. And it, as Tommaso was talking about this, it reminds me of Jim Deers, who had written a book, Neighbor Power. He was a Alinsky trained organizer in Seattle, who at one point refers to the GD organizers. And I thought he meant the goddamn organizers. And he said, no, not goddamn. The GD organizers are the grim and determined organizers. Grim and determined. They are so taken with their single issue that they're, trampling on the people they're trying to work with. Grim and determined. They can think about one thing. In the Deers book, or the Deers profile, actually, he refers to John McKnight, who said there's a resonance between organizing and duck hunting. What's the resonance? He said, duck hunters know there are a range of calls, a range of duck calls. Organizers too many organizers only sound the loon call, and then they're surprised that only the loons show up to the meetings. And it's a wonderful metaphor to think about sort of a multi-vocality, a multi-linguisticality, if you want, of if organizers are only worried about this one issue, they will ignore people who are coming because they want to work with each other. They're interested less in the issue than in being part, they're activists in the neighborhood, all sorts of things. So the notion of ritualization, even celebration, this book scratches the surface of, but certainly really important. I have a doctoral student working on that, and Tommaso, I will tell him to write to you because you'll give him lots of advice, I'm sure. The last point Tommaso made about that critical pragmatism doesn't do justice yet to the richness of stories. You had 2 or 3 points in this last point that really, really important, and thank you very much for pointing it out. First of all, absolutely, how do I say this? On the richness of stories, I did a lot of work with Martha Nussbaum's Love's Knowledge. And Love's Knowledge helped me if people listening don't know of this book, this is a magnificent book. And if you only read 2 chapters, I make a pitch for it. One is called Finally Aware, Richly Responsible. The subtitle is Literature and the Moral Imagination. I was teaching an ethics course way back when, and so when I saw the subtitle, yes, exactly, Barbara, thank you. Absolutely, a magnificent book. I started too much to say. When I was trying to understand how to study planners' practices earlier on. This book is about more than planners' practices, but so I wondered how to get accounts of their practice. And I ran into a bunch of problems. Surveys weren't going to tell me about the fine grain situatedness of the work. And at one point, a student working for me does an interview with a planner in New York. She writes up the interview, comes back with 3.5 pages of nicely written, as if a newspaper story about this guy's work. And it's perfectly competently written about his work, but it's sort of flat. So I took Studs Terkel's book, Working, who was a famous oral historian. And I said, Linda, go back to your interview and do what Terkel did. transcribe the first person voice interview as you heard it. Take yourself out and give us the story. Give us what you learned from this interview in the speaker's own voice. So she goes back, and now her 3.5 pages is now 9 pages, first person voice of this guy in New York trying to connect LaGuardia to Kennedy Airport with Underground. Still hasn't happened. But it's 9 pages of his description of his work. We'd never done this before, right? So I took this 9 pages and I went to class the following week and I gave it to them and I said, look, here's somebody who has graduated from our department, who's at work as a transportation planner in New York City. Here, in his own words, is what he's doing. If you're interested, take a look. We were reading Gaventa, Power and Powerlessness. You know, they had plenty to read. I came back the following week. I couldn't make this up. I came back the following week. I said, has anybody read this guy's story? Half of the class had not, half of the class had. Hands go up. Barbara Shapiro in the last row. What do you think? Barbara says, now I know what to tell my mother when she asks, what do planners do? And I had a chill because this haunts the field, because we have housing planners and transportation planners and environmental planners. Are they all different? Or is there any, what do they do? Now I know what to tell my mother. And I thought, oh my gosh, the kid next to her, Sean Cole. Yeah, Sean, what did you think? Sean says, Professor Forrester, this 9 pages is the most practical thing I have read in this department in 3 years. Right? Now, at this point, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. To laugh because this first person voice account of the planners trying to work on this underground, this first person account has grabbed them and shaken them. Barbara knows what to tell her mother. Sean says it's more practical than anything he's read in 3 years in the program. So something here works wonderfully. And that was great. Why cry? Because I had no clue. I mean, I have to admit, I had done all this work in speech act analysis and the micro, symbolic interactionism and so on. I didn't know how to work with narrative, with story, with these larger accounts. And a few weeks later, I discovered this essay of Nussbaum, whose subtitle is Literature and the Moral Imagination. And I'm curious, okay, let's look. This essay of Nussbaum is about how we can learn about ethics from novels. Now, novels are cooked, right? Novels are fiction. Novels are made up. So how can we learn from fiction, from what's made up about ethics? So she writes an unbelievable essay. She takes Henry James. She shows in the dialogue of the father and the daughter what's going on in the story as James has written it. She shows how if you change one word in the dialogue, the interaction changes, the whole point changes. And so I'm reading Nussbaum about ethics and literature, and I'm understanding how to work with planner stories. And so reading that piece of Nussbaum, as Barbara showed the book, changed 30 years of my work, basically, because it led to 10 years in which I then wrote this, The Deliberative Practitioner, which is all basically the first thing I wrote, really based on accounts, practice stories of planners from research interviews, essentially. And it's unpacking their accounts, the richness and the rich detail of their accounts. And so when Tommaso says critical pragmatism doesn't get us there yet to the richness of the accounts, you are absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. And these are two sort of threads that I've been trying to merge, I suppose, because what the critical pragmatist must do is do the discernment, the listening, the payment of attention to particulars that Nussbaum does write about. So I said there are two chapters in the book Barbara showed you. The first chapter is the finally aware and richly responsible, wonderful. But the second chapter is the theory chapter on practical judgment and discernment and an Aristotelian account. It's harder going, but it's worth the work. And she writes even about moral improvisation as the work of judgment. I mean, she talks about what she calls the priority of the particular. Priority of the particular means when we react to situations, if we're not simply acting by rote, and we're really responding to this situation, right? Each new situation that we're in, we are recognizing the particulars that make this situation the unique situation it is and makes it different from yesterday's and the day before's, right? So that we're not just responding rote, but we're actually responding to particulars. And Nussbaum lays this out in a really compelling way. So that's to say, this tension between the pragmatism and the richness of story is absolutely right. But I think there is if we would draw the Venn diagram, I think there is an overlap between the broadly Aristotelian discernment and attention to the particulars and the critical pragmatists' more enacted performative engagement with those particulars and the other, actually. So that was the first part of your fifth point, which was fascinating. But then the other point, which is really, really interesting, is about the threat of openness of a pragmatism. What the pragmatism gives with a gesture of openness toward learning, you're suggesting pragmatist almost takes away with this danger that it can be exhausting. Where does it exactly. where does it stop? And here I had the echo of graduate school, which is an embarrassingly long time ago, when I had the really fabulous luck to spend a year in a political theory seminar with Hannah Pitkin at Berkeley. And she had just written this amazing book, Wittgenstein and Justice. And I was fascinated by, I was trying to learn about language philosophy and Wittgenstein and Austin. But there is a famous quote, I guess, a move that Wittgenstein makes, and I think in the book On Certainty, which is, and the quote is, reasons come to an end. Reasons come to an end. And what Wittgenstein meant there, I think, was something about an appeal to conventions that allow us to stop at some point, so that the learning process isn't infinite, but that at some point reasons come to an end and we say, okay, this is going to be good enough. Now, obviously that can't just be expedience. It can't be a very narrow Herbert Simon-esque satisficing of lowering expectations. And so the question that Tommaso raises is, how can we think about learning, experimentation, argument, search in ways that don't exhaust us, but in ways that help us find new things, help us to be surprised, help us learn, help us identify new value, but also allow us at some point to acceptably to stop. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little bit of planning literature about famous article on wicked problems that my Berkeley professors had written, and one of the wicked problems is that there are no stopping rules, which is exactly Tommaso's problem. You know, when do we stop? And so this, I think, this is answerable, and typically the colloquially expedient pragmatist stops with the immediate constraints, what my boss wants, or what, you know, or the less interesting interpretation of what my boss wants. The critical pragmatist is going to take into account what my boss wants, but also the pressure we're likely to get from this person, the pressure we're likely to get from that person. And so a critical pragmatist has got to have different stopping rules that can't be exhausting. Because as you say, these cases, they actually do get things done. And all right, so this problem of stopping rule is important, and I will stop in a sec. The last issue that Tommaso raises that is really, really crucial, and I see this with my colleague David Laws. In Amsterdam, we've written a book called Conflict, Improvisation, Governance, and we see that some people take such a mechanistic view of conflict that it seems to wipe out all sorts of other moves of engaging conflict. And so if as I said, Tommaso's comments sort of beg questions about what does context mean and lead us to unpack it. Equally, your comments lead us to the importance of not having reductive ideas of conflict, acknowledging conflict, but seeing all of the different things that conflict means, all the different ways that conflict can be engaged, negotiated, undermined, subverted, so on. And certainly what I find appealing about close attention to cases like this is that you see in the fine grain ways that people deal with conflict where other people think, oh, well, the door is locked. No, the door's just closed. You got to go try the door and see what's possible. And so that chapter that I mentioned of Mike Hughes working on the bridge, I mean, it's just an astonishing story about the war between the designers and the engineers on the one hand, but Hughes working with everybody and literally at one point saying to the transportation authorities, you will never get this bridge unless we design it. And they think he's out of his mind. But of course, they've been stuck for 30 years. So he basically says, well, how's it been working for you? Not so well. So they have a discussion, well-informed, accountable, with the engineers at the table, of course, so that the design they come up with is something that in fact can be built, and it is built. So if there was a way of ripping out that chapter from the rest of the book, I would urge you all to do that, but my publisher would kill me. And so it's just an astonishing chapter itself. Anyway, let me stop there, and Yuri, please take it over.
Okay, great. Thanks really a lot.
And Tom, let me say once again, Tommaso, I'm really indebted. Thank you very much. And I look forward to coffee, beer, whatever it is, when we get past Zoom.
Yeah,
exactly.
Post-Zoom era.
Okay, thank you all.
So thanks actually both John and Tommaso for this very nice exchange and challenging exchange, pointing and finding some understanding of some of the issues addressed. I think it brought us one step further, definitely. I would like to open the floor for Q&A. So I really would like, in a participatory setting, like the planning approach that John is proposing, that also this session should be actually not just listening, but engaging with the author and the discussion. So it would be nice if you raise your hands, ask your questions, make your comments, cast your doubts. Alexa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John, and also Tommaso. This was really completely inspiring, although I missed part of it. I'm really sorry. But from what I got, this is really the conversation I like to have about the everyday in urban planning, in social movements, in how the city is lived, experienced, and designed. I'm an urban ethnographer, and I have a question for John, and perhaps it was part of the part of the presentation that I missed. My experience with a small study on a tenant initiative in Berlin was, and that initiative was quite diverse, socially, ethnically, gender, age, whatever, that those who participated with a long breath managed to make the time they invested more than just political or just related to the case as such, but made it a time of friendship, a time of entrepreneurial thoughts and practices. And so they somehow duplicated or even more the time they invested. It was more than one time. And I was wondering if for planners to have a long breath and I mean, it's a completely different constellation, of course, than a grassroots initiative. But if this notion of multiplication of time if you could observe this, if there is a change in quality of investment on the side of planners, when they managed to make it more than just planning work time, like leisure time too, or something. That's my question. Thank you.
I haven't thought about it in terms of temporality, and I don't know, not thinking of things in terms of temporality. What comes to mind, though, I think you'll appreciate, was I was on a sabbatical and I was doing interviews like this for an earlier book on Israelis, and I happened to interview the chief city engineer of Tel Aviv, who talked about studying urban design at Columbia University, and with him was a Japanese colleague who had managed to work on a huge multimodal transportation center in downtown Tokyo. And Yoskowitz, my interviewee, had asked him, how in the world in downtown Tokyo could you have built such an enormous project? How did you do it? And the answer was over 2,000 cups of tea. Right? And I was at a dispute resolution conference in Seoul, actually, in Asia. And we were, there were Malaysians and Chinese and Japanese and so on. And the question was, what can we say about context resolution across these incredibly different contexts? And I told this story, 2,000 cups of tea. And everybody eyes got big and said, oh, yes. So what you're pointing to, and which Tommaso pointed out in the ritualization, of course, is really fundamental. And in any even negotiation course, for example, more generally, people are always going to say that any relation has sort of a double or a triple structure. One, there's a procedure, there's the content of what it is you're fighting about, you're negotiating, but there's the relationship. And if you don't pay attention to the relationship, you're never going to negotiate anything else. The other will just, be pissed off, will be humiliated, will be angry, will be infuriated. You're never going to get anything done. So the relationship aspect, right, is always crucial. And I think depending on ideological backgrounds, maybe, and other social and cultural pressures, people will pay more attention to these issues or less attention to these issues, as you're pointing out. They're certainly important, but so my example earlier, Jim Deere's, the grim and determined organizers, they were the ones who precisely did not pay attention to these issues of friendship and longer term relationships. There's a wonderful, well, I should stop. I can send you a paper about a Dutch planner who talks about his community organizing. And for the first hour and a half, for 3 years in The Hague, for the first hour and a half, they talk about the schools and housing. And I said, yeah, and then he said, and then we'd put on the phonograph and we'd dance and we'd play games and we'd play cards. Yeah. And so there was the brilliant case where he said, look, you can't do the community building and the community organizing without what you and Tommaso pointed to. So I'll try to send you that chapter.
Thank you. I will write you for the email. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Any further questions or comments? I think the discussion can develop very nicely. So please take the floor, ask your question, make your comment. Would be highly appreciated. Don't be shy. We are in a participatory setting. So that's the best option possible. And John disappeared. Okay.
No, sorry.
The camera follows you, actually, I realized. When you move around, the camera follows you. Technology somehow.
The wonder of Apple.
Yeah. Okay.
We won't talk about Siri, which is the worst part of Apple.
If nobody asks a question, I have also a few issues and comments I'd like to put on the floor.
Sure.
While you were talking, it reminded me a bit, I don't know if you remember when we were in Den Haag or in the Dutch context about all this project. There was one project about the best person. And I don't know if you remember. You remember the project?
Oh, yeah.
It was a bit weird as a title, but it seems to me that your planners transforming space into place could be seen as people who are interacting with the context, use the context or use the ingredients that the context provides them and produce in a dialogue or co-produce in a dialogue the planning process. Mm. And I was wondering, so there is a level of abstraction that is decontextualized because these people have specific qualities wherever they are, in the most institutionalized or in the most dilapidated context, they produce something good. They produce in this relational way, in this dialogue, the best possible. And I was wondering the role of institutions in all of that, because institutions are part of a context, are part of the resources these people interact with, but institutions are very different, and institutions are less fluid than many other ingredients of this recipe. Institutions have different temporalities. They can stay over hundreds of years. They can provide a lot of resources, or they can provide a lot of constraints and impede even at the best possible knowledge of the actors involved options. So I was wondering how you see in this tension between structural, infrastructural, institutional settings and this agency, planners, let's say, use of or creative way of entering in this dialogue, the role of these institutions. Because if you plan in Stockholm or in the Nordic countries where there is a lot of resources, it's different than planning in Sicily or different than planning in the UK or the US, where the market plays a very important role and you have to build growth coalitions, otherwise you cannot access resources to make things done. So I was wondering this recipe, how it works when you use it in different contexts, and the role of institutions, of course.
Sure. Well, I mean, Tommaso was getting at this, I think, in a number of ways. The first question comes, of course, how you understand institutions on a spectrum from, let's say, underdetermined to overdetermined, right? I mean, there are institutional settings that are far more controlling, less controlling, in all kinds of ways. So that's why I brought up the issues of discretion and improvisation, and so on. So I think of a pianist, Claude Frank, a classical pianist, who says, classical musicians improvise all the time, we just don't change the notes. Right? So the notion that a classical score, you have to follow the notes, is an institutional sort of legacy, right? You're going to play a Beethoven quartet, you're not going to change the notes. It's recognizable as a Beethoven quartet, but you know there's a zillion ways to play the same Beethoven quartet, right? And so that's part of my intuitive response to your question. Yes, institutions matter, but institutions can be played, institutions can be read, institutions can be managed, can be resisted, can be implemented in a lot of different ways. And I think that's part of what we see in the cases. We do not see any recipes. There isn't a recipe in the book. There's capacities of context responsiveness, I would say, in which people are doing an institutional analysis in the moment and in an improvisational way. So working with the many norms that institutions bring up, but the norms can be conflicting, right? You can't satisfy. So I used to do I didn't refine this very much, I think because a sabbatic got in the way, but I tried to understand why it is that the more simple the rule context, the more constraining, and the more complex the rule context, the more freedom. So I remember in class once I said, okay, I want you all to go and stand over by the window. Everybody got up and went over by the window. Then I said, okay, now I want you to follow not that one instruction, but now I give you 4 instructions. 1, stand by the window, congregate near the door, jump up and down, stretch, sit in place. And people did all kinds of different things because they had more rules to honor, right? And I think what you see in a classical performance is just that kind of thing. Okay, we don't change the notes, but there are issues of timing and the way notes are shaped and the way we respond to one another in a quartet. All of that is up for grabs, which is why the same quartet can be played one way by the Vienna String Quartet and another way by the Guarneri and another by the New York, right? So in the same way that Tommaso appealed to maybe an overly simple reading of conflict, we have that same danger with institutions, that we make institutions overly determinate, as opposed to being quite robustly rich and providing opportunities for many ways of improvising within them. So there's an interesting book. I'm trying to remember I'm blanking now. A recent book from MIT Press, political scientist, all about discretion, ends up with a sort of mechanistic Foucaultian reading at the end. And the word improvisation doesn't appear in the whole otherwise magnificent, interesting book. And it's crazy.
I'm totally with you. I'm totally with you with that. I have a very quick follow-up question.
Please.
So you might have this quartet and it's played in different ways, but it might make a difference if you have one violin less because resources are not available. Maybe institutional resources.
Sure.
Where improvisation is more challenging because you need to think about how can I substitute this instrument to have the same output or whatever. So this materiality or this, not the liquidity of the process, but the...
Well, absolutely. I mean, the materiality, but the materiality, what's at hand and what we have to work with always matters. Absolutely. Okay, but then given what's at hand, there'll be a dozen different ways of working with it. And since what we often have to work with are, all kinds of social relationships, that have such interesting possibilities, capacities. I think of in the book on dealing with difference that you mentioned, the dramas of mediating public disputes. There's a chapter about Lisa Butler in California, who inherits a fight between environmentalists and off-road vehicle users and hunters about destroying or protecting parklands. And they've been suing each other and they've been in court and been hell for 20 years. And I said to her at one point, Lisa, when you go to that room, when you get to the threshold of that room, I know many of my colleagues would turn around and go the other way because there's such anger and fury in that room. And Lisa's response was, if I know they're angry, I know the world is not the way they want it to be. And I know that they really want to change the world. And my job is to help them get there. Their anger is not about me. Their anger is capacity. But lots of people would think, oh, anger, it's irrationality, and dismiss it. She sees it as an incredible resource. Right? I got in the car that afternoon. I was picked up by my cousin who was a retired child psychiatrist. And I said, Tom, this mediator just told me the most interesting thing about anger. And anger is fuel for change. He smiled and he said, that's what a good psychiatrist would say. So I think institutions maybe can be understood to be often less determinate, less all controlling than. It's easier to think nothing is possible. It's harder to think, what if we did this? What if we did that? What if we made a coalition? What if we organized this way? So that's what the book tries to show, is not taking the more literal impossibility literally, as given, but see it as contingent. And let's explore it. Let's see what's possible.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, John. I think that answer fits very well.
I have the moment. If anybody else has a question, Alexa, please send me an email so I have your address so I can send you that article. Great.
Any other comments and questions before we?
Mollenkopf came back for more punishment.
Yes. John, please.
So like Tommaso, I feel privileged to be part of this long voyage because I had many conversations with you about this book in formation long ago when our little tribe was gathering in the Netherlands. And so I'm interested to see how it's come along and come to fruition, and congratulations on that. And
thank you.
And as Tommaso said, it's really important to spread stress, process, creativity, making the result at the moment rather than having some goal that you're trying to cram everything towards. I appreciate all those qualities of the book, but you said before there's no recipe in the book, but if you're thinking about this as a kind of performance, presumably the actors can be trained. And
Sure.
So I'm interested in, who does the training? Or do we all train ourselves? What entity, if any, is fostering the propagation of this approach to the planning enterprise?
Sure. No, look, great question, important question. Think about it, comes to mind as a spectrum between sort of a technocratic answers on the one hand, do X, right? Here's the way you solve the equations. I mean, I did enough work in engineering, so I have an appreciation for solving a set of differential equations. You get an answer, you plug it back in, it works. Wonderful. Okay, great. But on the other end, from a technocratic solution, on the other end, you've got a complex context. You have a story about dealing with complexity, essentially. And I think in the applied fields, we try to give our students the whole range, an exposure to the whole range. Expertise for well-defined problems on one hand, and responses to poorly defined problems in fluid contexts on the other hand. So Nussbaum's case, the humanist case, is ethics isn't a set of commandments. Ethics is understanding the complexity of a lived life. And so Nussbaum's argument, of course, is we learn about ethics from novels because novels begin to do justice to loyalty, betrayal, anger, callousness, all of those qualities that we can't put into a set of equations. So the quote that I gave of Iris Murdoch is half of the answer to your question. Murdoch saying, where virtue is concerned, we apprehend more than we clearly understand, and we grow by looking. What she means is we look at cases of good work, and we sort of get more. Excuse me, hold on a sec. We still there? Yeah. Murdoch saying we sort of get more, we see more than we clearly understand. And by looking and seeing about action and context responsiveness, we learn, we see how certain things are done. We see something is kind or something is callous and so on. It seems to me that our courses, studio courses, for example, courses that are, try to model learning by experience, are gestures in that direction. They tell students from the beginning, we don't know really what the problems are here in this community. Let's go and try to learn, try to find out. Let's try to keep our mouths shut and listen and not, jump the gun. So there's all kinds of ways that we teach applied work. And John, we see it in all of the disciplines. There's the same fights in medicine, right? There's the clinical folks and the basic researchers and doctors all over the spectrum. And the clinical folks are stressing complexity, humility, learning, diagnosis, essentially, right? So I think we do these things all the time without recipes, but with good examples, powerful examples, rich examples that are powerful because they're so clear. And so these materials have been wonderful in class, because if students will fight, you know, my classes, I try to complement the theoretical material with these profiles. Students love the profiles because they're first person voice stories and they get it. So when Barbara Shapiro, I think you were going, Barbara Shapiro said in class once, now I know what to tell my mom what planners do. She was saying she gets from the story the complexity and the need to deal with that complexity, and that it's possible to deal with that complexity. Right? So that's the beginning of an answer. Send me your email so we can keep in touch. I
already did.
Okay, wonderful.
So,
I got an eye on the clock. We're almost time. Yuri, I want to again thank you so much for this. And Tommaso was really, really a gift. So please, I have your email. Yeah, we're going to stay in touch. Absolutely.
Very good.
And
so
others. So thank you all.
Thanks a lot, John, and thanks to all who convened. And it was really a very interesting and fruitful exchange, new insights, new stimulations, new inspirations for further improvisations in the future. We have the next Hot of a Press on the 22nd of June, which will be the last before the summer. And it will be about the book by Hilary Angelo, When Green Became Good, which she published relatively recently. So you are all invited. And yes, thanks, Paul. Paul posted in the chat the link to the event. So whoever is interested, you are kindly invited to join and to take also an active part in the discussion. And enjoy the rest of an evening. And thanks a lot in particular to John and Tommaso.
Oh, thank you again. It was an honor and a great pleasure.